The dust of Fog Hollow settled on everything, a fine gray powder that clung to hope and choked it silent. It settled on the splintered porch of Lena Prue's cabin, on the unpainted boards that had grayed like an old woman's hair, and on the shoulders of Lena herself as she moved through a world that had long ago decided what she was. They called her mule-faced, a name whispered in the general store behind cupped hands, a laugh swallowed in the saloon when she passed by the swinging doors. The name had been forged in the cruel fire of the schoolyard and had followed her into womanhood, branding her soul with a scar she could not hide. So she hid herself instead. She worked her small plot of land on the edge of town with a ferocity that left her hands cracked and her back a knot of constant pain. The work was a shield. The silence was a fortress. Inside, she was a ghost in her own life, a bell without a clapper hanging in a steeple of loneliness, unable to sound a single note of her own worth. Her only mirror was a shard of glass, salvaged from a vanity her mother had once owned, a thing of rosewood and grace that had been shattered in the fire that took everything but the land and the whispers. The shard was just large enough to show a single eye, a portion of a cheekbone, the hard line of her jaw. It was enough. It was too much. Most days she avoided it, dressing in the pre-dawn gloom, tying back her dull brown hair by feel alone. She knew the map of her own face by heart, a terrain of disappointment she had been forced to memorize. A nose a little too broad, a mouth a little too wide, eyes set just a fraction too close. It was a face built for labor, not for love, a face the town had judged and found wanting, and in the quiet, desperate hours before the sun rose, she agreed with them. She moved through the town like a shadow, her gaze fixed on the ground before her, counting the cracks in the boardwalk, the stones in the dirt road. Her transactions were brief, her words clipped. A bag of flour from Mr. Gable, a spool of thread, a pound of nails. She paid in coin and silence, her presence an apology. The women of the town, with their soft hands and floral dresses, would draw their children closer when she passed, as if her ugliness were a contagion. Their pity was worse than their scorn. It was a thick, sweet poison that suggested she was a tragedy, a life wasted. Lena preferred the clean cut of hatred. It was honest. One afternoon, when the sun was a hot white coin in the sky, she was mending a fence post at the far edge of her property, the one that bordered the old Fenwick ranch. The Fenwicks were gone now, lost to fever and misfortune years ago, the land sold off piece by piece until only the dilapidated homestead remained. A man was standing there near the sagging porch of the old house. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a rider, but he stood with a stillness that was unnatural. His head was tilted, as if listening to something far beyond the chirping of the crickets. She watched him for a long moment, her hammer forgotten in her hand. Strangers were rare, and strangers who stood so quietly were rarer still. He wore a worn duster and a hat pulled low, but she could see the line of his jaw, stubbled and strong. He did not seem to be looking at anything at all. He took a hesitant step, then another, his boot catching on an overgrown root. He stumbled, catching himself on the railing of the porch, his hand landing inches from a rotten plank. Lena's heart gave a lurch, an unfamiliar thud of concern. She was not a woman given to neighborly intrusions. Her world was bordered by her fences, and she guarded them jealously. But the man's stillness was a kind of vulnerability she recognized. It was a different sort of isolation, but it was isolation all the same. She wiped her sweaty palms on her canvas trousers and walked towards him, her footsteps muffled by the dusty grass. "You best be careful of that porch," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "The whole thing's ready to give." The man flinched at the sound of her voice, his head snapping in her direction. But his eyes, she saw now, did not focus. They were a pale, clouded blue, like a winter sky seen through smoke. They looked past her, through her. He was blind. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. His voice was calm, a low baritone that seemed to absorb the heat of the afternoon. "I was just trying to get my bearings. The name's Cole Fenwick. This place used to be mine." Lena stopped a few feet away. A Fenwick, the last of them. She had heard stories that a son had survived, gone east after the tragedy, but no one had seen him in more than a decade. "Lena Prow," she offered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. She never offered it. People already knew it. "Prow," he repeated softly. "You live on the neighboring land, then?" "I do." He smiled, a slight, weary curve of his lips. It was a smile that did not mock, did not judge. It was just a smile. It unsettled her. "Funny, coming home to a place you can't see. It's all just sound and memory. I remember a creek running through here. I can still hear it." "It's mostly dried up now," she said, her usual bluntness a comfort. "Just a trickle in the spring." "Ah." The smile faded. He ran a hand over the rough wood of the porch railing, his fingers tracing the grain, learning its story of neglect. "Some things don't last." He turned his face towards her again, his unseeing eyes searching the space where she stood. "Would you mind, Miss Proul? Could you tell me what color the house is now? It was white once. My mother was very proud of its whiteness." Lena looked at the house. The paint had peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing the dark, weathered wood beneath. It was the color of sorrow, of abandonment. "It's not white anymore," she said. "It's mostly just wood." He nodded slowly. "I suppose that's to be expected." He stood there for a long moment, lost in a world she could not enter, a world of memory and sound. Lena felt a strange urge to fill the silence, to fix something. It was the same urge that made her reset a fallen fence post or stitch a torn seam. She was a mender of things, not of people. "Is there something you needed?" she asked, her tone more brusque than she intended. "No, not really. Just wanted to stand here for a bit." He sighed, a deep, rattling sound. "The stage dropped me in town. I need to arrange for someone to bring my trunk out. Didn't realize how far it was to walk." "It's a good 2 miles, she confirmed. "Feels like 100. He offered another of those small, unsettling smiles. "Funny how your legs remember a distance your eyes have forgotten." An awkward silence fell between them. Lena should have turned and walked away. She should have gone back to her fence, to the familiar rhythm of hammer and nail. But she didn't. She stayed, rooted to the spot, watching this man who could not watch her back. He was the first person in years who had spoken to her without a flicker of revulsion or pity in his eyes, because he couldn't see them. The thought was both a relief and a new kind of wound. "I have a wagon," she heard herself say. The words came out before she could stop them. I could fetch your trunk for you." He turned his head fully towards her, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "You'd do that?" "It's no trouble," she lied. It was trouble. It meant driving into town, facing the stares, the whispers. It meant inviting this man, this stranger, further into her sealed-off world. "I'd be grateful, Miss Prue, truly." He reached into his duster. "I can pay you for your time." "No need," she said, already turning away, anxious to escape the gratitude in his voice. "I'll be back before sundown." She didn't wait for his reply. She walked back to her cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had broken her own rule. She had offered help. She had engaged. As she hitched her sturdy mule, Patience, to the wagon, she caught a glimpse of herself in the shard of mirror hanging by the door, a flash of a plain, hard face. She turned away quickly, the familiar shame washing over her. But this time, something else was mingled with it, a flicker of something she couldn't name. It felt like purpose. When she returned with his trunk, the sun was bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. Cole was sitting on the top step of the porch, the one she knew to be solid, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. The shavings fell around his boots in a pale, fragrant cloud. He looked up as the wagon wheels crunched on the gravel, his head cocked. "Miss Prue?" "I have your trunk," she said, pulling Patience to a halt. He stood, folding the knife and slipping it into his pocket. "You are a woman of your word." He walked carefully towards the sound of her voice, his hands slightly outstretched. "Let me help you with that. I can manage." Her words were sharp, a defense against his offered proximity. She wrestled the heavy trunk off the back of the wagon, her muscles straining. It thumped to the ground, raising a cloud of dust. "Thank you," he said again, his voice soft. He was standing close now, closer than anyone had stood to her in years, except for Mr. Gable handing over a sack of grain. She could smell the scent of sawdust and trail dust on him, a clean, earthy smell. She found herself holding her breath. "The door's unlocked," she said, stepping back. "Or the lock's rusted through. Same difference." He navigated his way to the trunk, his hands finding its leather-bound edges. He seemed to learn its shape through his fingertips, a map of brass and buckles. "I'll need to get some supplies tomorrow. Food, a lantern, kerosene. The store closes at 5. "Right." He paused. "I don't suppose— No, it's too much to ask." Lena knew what he was going to ask. He needed a guide. He needed eyes. The thought sent a wave of panic through her. To walk through town with him? To be seen with him? The whispers would become a roar. The blind man and the mule-faced woman, a pair of freaks, a joke for the saloon. "I have to be in town tomorrow anyway," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I can show you the way." She could feel his smile without seeing it. "Miss Prue, you are turning out to be my salvation." She grunted in response, a sound of dismissal. Salvation? He didn't know what he was saying. She was no one's salvation. She was a blight, a thing to be endured. She turned to leave, her work done. "Wait," he called out. "Your name, Lena. Is it short for something?" She stopped, her back to him. "Evangeline." The name felt like a beautiful dress that had never fit. A name her mother had loved. A name she had buried. "Evangeline," he said, rolling the syllables slowly. "That's a beautiful name." Lena climbed onto her wagon, her hands shaking slightly as she took the reins. She did not reply. She slapped the reins against Patience's broad back and headed for home, the sound of his beautiful, hollow word echoing in the twilight. Beautiful. A word that had never been spoken in the same breath as her name. A word that had no place in her world. The next day, she found a single dried wildflower resting on her porch railing. It was a sprig of Indian paintbrush, its faded orange a ghost of its summer vibrancy. She picked it up, her rough fingers gentle. It must have blown there from the fields, she told herself. A trick of the wind. She took it inside and placed it in a small, empty jar on her mantelpiece, next to the bell her father had once bought for a cow, the one that had lost its clapper long ago. It sat there, a tiny splash of forgotten color in the gray room. Walking with Cole through Fog Hollow was everything she had feared. She walked a step ahead of him, his hand resting lightly on her elbow, a contact that sent a tremor through her entire body. She could feel the eyes on them. Mrs. Gable, sweeping the porch of the general store, stopped her broom mid-sweep, her mouth a perfect O of shock. Two ranchers talking by the water trough fell silent, their gazes following the strange pair. Lena kept her eyes fixed forward, her jaw tight. She was his guide. That was all. She pointed out the location of the store, the blacksmith, the livery. Her voice was flat, mechanical. Inside the store, the air grew thick with unspoken judgment. Mr. Gable, a man whose face was a permanent sneer, looked from Cole's clouded eyes to Lena's plain face, a flicker of cruel amusement in his expression. "Well, well," he said, polishing a glass jar with a dirty rag. "Lena, found yourself a fella, have you?" Lena's face burned. She felt Cole's hand tighten on her elbow, a small, reassuring pressure. "This is Mr. Fenwick," Lena said, her voice strained. "He needs supplies." "Fenwick," Gable mused, his eyes narrowing. "The blind one, heard you were back." The words hung in the air, an insult disguised as a fact. Cole's expression did not change. His calm was a rock against which Gable's malice broke. "That's right," he said, his voice even. "I'll need flour, coffee, bacon, beans, and a gallon of kerosene." Lena stood beside him, reading the prices on the tins, describing the quality of the smoked bacon, her voice a low monotone. She was aware of every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of a dress as other customers moved around them, giving them a wide berth. She was a spectacle. They were a spectacle. As Gable tallied the cost, Cole turned his head towards her. "Is there anything you need, Lena?" he asked, his voice for her alone. The use of her first name, so simple, so natural, undid her. No one called her Lena without a sneer attached. She shook her head, unable to speak. "Get yourself something," he insisted quietly. "A ribbon for your hair, some candy." "I don't need anything," she mumbled, her eyes on the floor. He paid Gable, the coins clinking on the counter with a terrible finality. As they left, Lena could feel every eye in the store on her back. Outside, in the harsh sunlight, she wanted to pull her arm away, to run back to the safety of her cabin. "Thank you," Cole said, breaking the tense silence. "I couldn't have done that without you." "It was nothing," she said. "It wasn't nothing." He stopped, turning to face her. "I know what they're like. I grew up here too." He paused. "Their judgment is a cage. Don't let them lock you in it." How could he know? How could this man, who had been gone for so long, who could not see the sneers and the glares, understand the precise shape of her prison? She pulled her arm away. "I should get back. I have chores." "Lena." His voice was gentle, but it stopped her cold. He reached out, his hand finding her arm again. "Don't run from me, please." She looked at his face, at the pale, unseeing eyes that somehow saw more than anyone else. She saw the lines of weariness around his mouth, the faint scar on his temple. He was not a savior. He was just a man, wounded in his own way, asking for something she didn't know how to give. Connection. She gave a small, jerky nod. "I'm not running." They walked the rest of the way back in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the full silence of shared understanding. When they reached his dilapidated house, he hesitated at the path. Would you stay for a cup of coffee?" he asked. "I'm not much of a host, but I can boil water." She should have said no. She should have retreated to her fortress. But the thought of her silent cabin, with its single dried flower and its tongueless bell, was suddenly unbearable. "All right," she said. "A quick cup." Inside, the house smelled of dust and decay. But Cole moved with a growing familiarity, his hands brushing against walls, locating the pot-bellied stove, the water pump in the kitchen. Lena found herself helping, finding the coffee tin, locating 2 chipped mugs. They sat at a rickety table as the coffee boiled, the late afternoon light slanting through the grimy windows. "Tell me what the light looks like right now," he said suddenly. She looked at the shafts of dusty gold cutting through the gloom. "It's yellow," she said, the word inadequate. "And it makes the dust dance." "The dust dance?" he repeated, smiling. "I like that." He took a sip of the hot, bitter coffee. "I miss the light most of all. More than faces. More than reading. Just the color of things." She didn't know what to say. She had spent her life trying not to be seen, and here was a man who yearned for sight more than anything. "What happened?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could censor it. "Your eyes." He was silent for a moment, his hands wrapped around his mug. "A cattle drive, a stampede in a thunderstorm. A lightning strike hit a tree right over me. The flash, it burned them out. The doctor said it was a miracle I lived." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Some days, I'm not so sure about the miracle part." His confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, broken thing. Lena felt her own litany of small cruelties, of whispered insults and averted gazes, shrink in the face of his catastrophic loss. Her wounds were 1,000 tiny cuts. His was a single, devastating blow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. Pity is a poor substitute for company." He turned his face towards her. "I'd rather have this. A cup of coffee with a neighbor." They finished their coffee in a comfortable quiet. As she stood to leave, he stood as well. "Lena," he said, his voice hesitant, "there's something I've wanted to ask. It's forward of me. You can say no." Her heart began to pound. "I try to picture things," he said. "People. It helps. But I can't picture you. Your voice it's low and steady, like the sound of the creek I remember. But your face, I have no idea." He took a half step closer. "Would you let me see you? With my hands?" Terror seized her. A cold, absolute dread. For him to touch her face, to feel the geography of her ugliness, the broad nose, the wide mouth. He would know. Even without his sight, he would know why the town scorned her. He would feel the truth of it. His calloused hands, the hands of a cowboy, would trace the lines of her failure as a woman, and the kindness in his voice would curdle into the same pity she saw in everyone else's eyes. She backed away, shaking her head. "No, I can't." The hurt on his face was so plain, it was as if she had struck him. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I overstepped. Forgive me." "It's not you," she stammered, desperate to erase that look from his face. I have to go." She fled. She ran from his house as if the fire that took her mother's vanity was at her heels. She didn't stop until she was inside her own cabin, the door bolted behind her. She leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged sobs, her hands pressed to her cheeks. She stumbled to the broken mirror shard and stared at her reflection, at the sliver of her face that the world and she had condemned. It was a monster's face, a mule's face. He could never touch this. He could never know. For 3 days, she did not see him. She worked her land with a desperate, punishing energy, trying to sweat out the memory of his request, the look of hurt on his face. She saw smoke rising from the chimney of the Fenwick house, a thin white plume against the blue sky, a sign of life that taunted her. On the 4th morning, there was another flower on her porch railing, a wild prairie rose, its pink petals already starting to curl at the edges. It was impossibly beautiful. She left it there, a testament to her own cowardice. The next day, it was gone, likely taken by the wind. But its ghost remained. She was running out of flour. The trip to town was inevitable. The thought of it filled her with a familiar dread, but now it was compounded by a new fear, the fear of seeing Cole, of having to face him, to explain. She decided to go at midday when the town was busiest, hoping to lose herself in the small crowd. She was tying up Patience at the rail in front of the store when she heard his voice. He was talking to the blacksmith, his tone calm and steady. Lena's first instinct was to hide, to duck back into an alleyway, but she was frozen. He finished his conversation and turned, his white cane sweeping in a slow arc before him. He was learning to navigate the town on his own. A pang of something sharp and painful went through her. He was adapting. He was moving on without her. He must have heard her footsteps, the specific heavy tread of her work boots. He stopped, his head tilting. Lena. Her name on his lips was a soft blow. She could not run. Cole, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm glad I ran into you, he said, and there was no hint of recrimination in his voice, only a simple, direct warmth. I wanted to apologize again. For the other day, I was out of line. No, she said, surprising herself. You weren't. I was the one who was wrong. You weren't wrong, he corrected gently. You were scared. There's a difference. She looked at him, at his calm, patient face. He stood in the middle of the dusty street, an island of grace in a sea of judgment. The sun beat down on them. A wagon rattled past. Mrs. Gable was watching from her window, her face a mask of sour curiosity. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said, about the dancing dust. You see things, you really see them. I need that. I was wondering, would you be willing to just walk with me sometimes and tell me what you see? No payment, just company. It was an offering, a bridge across the chasm of her fear, not a request to see her, but a request for her to be his eyes. It was something she could do. It was a way to be near him without having to reveal the part of herself she so deeply loathed. Yes, she said, the word coming out with a rush of relief. I could do that. And so they began to walk. Not every day, but often. They walked the perimeter of her land, and she described the way the barbed wire rusted, the way the purple thistles grew in stubborn clumps. They walked to the dried-up creek bed, and she told him about the smooth gray stones and the skeletons of last year's cattails. They walked to the abandoned church at the edge of Fog Hollow, a place no one ever went. It stood on a small rise, its steeple stark against the sky. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of birds' nests and decay. A thick rope dangled from the ceiling, but the bell it was tied to was silent. Its clapper had been stolen by vandals years ago. Cole reached out and touched the thick, dusty rope. A bell that can't ring, he murmured. It feels lonely. Lena looked at the silent bell, a hollow metal mouth hanging open, unable to speak. She felt a kinship with it, voiceless, incomplete. It's just a piece of metal, she said. No, he disagreed softly. It's potential. It's a song waiting for a voice. On their walks, he would ask her to describe everything. The shape of a cloud, the color of the sky at sunset, the way a hawk circled overhead. At first, her descriptions were plain, factual. The cloud is white and puffy. The sky is orange. But he would press her, gently. But what kind of white, he would ask. Like milk? Or like bone? What kind of orange? Like a fire, or like a piece of fruit? He taught her to look. He taught her to find the words for the beauty she had spent her life ignoring. And as she gave the world to him in words, she began to claim it for herself. She started to notice the tiny blue flowers that grew in the cracks of the rocks, the iridescent sheen on a raven's wing, the way the wind made the tall grass whisper. Her world, once a monochrome of work and shame, was slowly, imperceptibly, filling with color. One evening, they were sitting on the steps of his porch, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the gathering dusk. A comfortable silence had settled between them, a silence that was no longer empty. Lena, he said, his voice quiet. He turned his body to face her more fully. I'm going to ask you again, and you can still say no. He took a breath. May I see your face? This time the terror was not as sharp. It was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was blunted by the memory of their shared walks, of his patient voice, of the colors he had given back to her. She thought of the silent bell. She thought of the dried flowers she now kept in a row on her mantle. Small acts of courage, small seeds of hope. She did not speak. She could not. But she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He seemed to sense the movement. He raised his hands slowly, as if not to frighten a wild creature. They were large hands, calloused from ranch work and rough from his new life of navigating by touch. They were strong, capable hands. They hovered in the air before her for a moment, and then, with an infinite tenderness, they came to rest on her face. Lena squeezed her eyes shut. She held her breath. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment he would feel the ugliness and recoil. His thumbs rested on her cheekbones, his fingers spread gently to cup her jaw. He was not probing. He was listening. His touch was a question. She felt the rough pads of his fingers trace the line of her brow, the curve of her cheek. They moved with a reverence that stole her breath. No one had ever touched her face like this. No one had ever touched her with anything but accidental brusqueness, or, in her memory of her mother, a hurried peck on the cheek. This was different. This was a form of sight. His touch was not an assessment of flaws. It was a discovery of landscape. He traced the bridge of her nose, his fingers light. He followed the shape of her mouth, his thumb brushing her bottom lip so softly it was like the touch of a moth's wing. A shiver went through her, a tremor that had nothing to do with fear. He was silent for a long, long time. His hands remained on her face, warming her skin. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. The world seemed to have stopped. There was only the chirping of the crickets and the feeling of his hands holding her face as if it were something precious. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It was low and awed. "Oh," he breathed. He moved his thumbs in a slow, circular motion on her cheeks. "I was wrong." Her heart plummeted. He knew. "Your voice," he continued, his voice a raw whisper. "I said it was like a creak. It's not. It's what you feel like." He drew his hands away slowly, as if reluctant to break the connection. He turned his unseeing eyes towards her, but she felt more seen in that moment than she ever had in her life. He said, "You feel like sunlight." The words did not compute. Sunlight, warm, life-giving, beautiful. He was talking about her face, the mule face, the face from the broken mirror. It was impossible. It was a mistake. But the sincerity in his voice was a pure, unwavering note. It bypassed her doubt and struck something deep inside her, something that had been silent for a very long time. A tear escaped from under her closed eyelid and traced a hot path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. She was not sobbing. She was just leaking. A dam of unshed tears that had held for 2 decades was finally breaking. He must have heard the small hitching sound of her breath because his hand found hers, his fingers lacing with her own. He did not say anything else. He just sat beside her, holding her hand, as the last of the light faded from the sky and the stars emerged, cold and distant. But for the first time in her life, she did not feel alone beneath them. Their friendship deepened into a quiet rhythm. He learned the paths around her cabin by heart. She read to him in the evenings from books she bought in town, her voice growing stronger, more confident with every page. He started to work on his house, his blindness a challenge, not a barrier. He taught himself to measure wood by feel, to drive a nail by sound. Lena found herself helping him, holding boards steady, handing him tools. They worked together, a team of broken parts that somehow made a whole. And he would describe her, not to others, but to her. When she brought him a cup of water, he would say, "Your hands are kindness." When she laughed, a rare, rusty sound, he would smile and say, "Your laugh is the sound of a key turning in a lock." He was sketching her, not with charcoal or paint, but with words. He was creating a portrait of her that was so beautiful, she could hardly believe it was her own. Slowly, tentatively, she began to. The town, of course, watched, and their watching turned to poison. The whispers grew louder. It was one thing for the mule-faced Proul girl to be a recluse. It was another for her to be seen constantly with the blind Fenwick boy. They couldn't comprehend the simple kindness between them. They saw only ugliness. They decided she was taking advantage of him, using his blindness to trap him. Mrs. Gable became the mouthpiece for the town's venom. "It's a disgrace," she'd say at the store, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "That poor boy, helpless as a kitten, and she's sinking her claws into him. Probably telling him she's some kind of beauty. What else is a blind man to believe?" The words found their way back to Lena, as such words always did. They were like stones thrown at the fragile new house of her self-worth. Each one left a bruise. The old shame, the familiar habit of hiding, began to creep back in. She started to make excuses not to walk with Cole, not to visit his house. She told him her chores were piling up. She told him she was tired. He knew she was lying. He could hear the retreat in her voice. One afternoon, he appeared at her door, navigating the path with his cane. "Lena," he said, standing on her porch. "What is it? What have they said to you?" "It's nothing," she said, not meeting his gaze. She was scrubbing her porch steps with a fury, as if she could scrub away the town's filth. "It is not nothing." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Look at me." She couldn't. She kept scrubbing. "They're saying I'm tricking you, that I'm taking advantage of you because you can't see what I really look like." The words came out in a choked whisper. He was silent for a moment. Then he knelt down beside her, his knees pressing into the damp wood. He reached out and stilled her frantic hands. "Do you believe that?" he asked softly. She looked up at him then, her eyes swimming with tears. "I don't know," she confessed. "It's what I've believed my whole life. It's hard to unlearn." "Then let me teach you," he said. He took her scrub brush from her hand and set it aside. He took her hands in his. Their words are echoes in an empty room. They have no meaning. What is real is this. He squeezed her hands. "What is real is the way you described the sunset to me so well, I felt I could feel its warmth on my face. What is real is the way you read stories to me until your voice is hoarse. That is what I see. That is what is true." He paused, his unseeing eyes searching for hers. "I am not the blind one, Lena. They are." His words were a balm, but the wound was deep. The annual town picnic was approaching, a day of forced festivity that Lena had avoided for 15 years. Cole announced that he wanted to go. "We should go," he said. "Together." "No," she said immediately. "Cole, you don't understand. It's the heart of the town. It's where they're at their worst." "Then that's where we need to be," he said, his jaw set with a quiet determination she had come to recognize. "We can't live our lives hiding from their ugliness. We have to show them they have no power over us." "They have power over me," she whispered. "Not anymore," he said. "Let me be your shield, just this once." The day of the picnic was bright and hot. The entire town was gathered in the meadow by the creek. There were long tables laden with food, quilts spread on the grass, children chasing each other with shrieks of laughter. Walking into that scene with Cole's hand on her arm was the hardest thing Lena had ever done. It felt as though every conversation stopped, every head turned. The air crackled with their arrival. She could feel the stairs like insects crawling on her skin. She wanted to turn and bolt, but Cole's grip was firm, a steady anchor in the swirling sea of judgment. They filled a plate with food, Cole asking her to describe each dish. She spoke in a low, trembling voice, acutely aware of the women who watched them, their faces tight with disapproval. They found a spot under a large oak tree, slightly away from the main crowd. But there was no escaping the atmosphere. It followed them, a cloud of malice. Lena was just lifting a piece of cornbread to her mouth when Mrs. Gable appeared before them, flanked by 2 of her cronies. Her face was flushed with self-righteousness. "Well, Cole Fenwick," she began, her voice loud and carrying, designed for an audience. "It's a shame to see you brought so low. Your dear mother would be heartbroken." Cole slowly placed his fork on his plate and turned his face toward the sound of her voice. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his tone perfectly level. "Don't you Mrs. Gable me?" she snapped. "We're all just so worried about you. This woman." She gestured towards Lena with a flick of her hand, a gesture of dismissal, of disgust. "She has you wrapped around her little finger, filling your head with who knows what lies about herself. If only you could see her. If only you knew what a plain, mule-faced creature you're keeping company with, you'd run a mile." The words struck Lena like a physical blow. Mule-faced. The word she'd heard in whispers her whole life, now shouted for the entire town to hear. The blood drained from her face. The meadow fell silent. Every eye was on her, on them. She could see the pity, the morbid curiosity, the smug satisfaction on their faces. They were watching her humiliation. This was her nightmare, come to life in the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. She started to rise, to flee, to run back to the one place she felt safe, her lonely cabin. But Cole's hand shot out and found her wrist, his grip gentle but unyielding. He held her there. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. He was tall, and in the sudden silence, he seemed to tower over everyone. He turned his blind gaze not just on Mrs. Gable, but panning slowly across the entire crowd, as if he could see each and every one of them. The silence deepened. It became uncomfortable, expectant. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was quiet, yet it carried across the meadow with a stunning clarity. "You are right about one thing, Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice resonating with a calm strength that made the air tremble. "I cannot see this woman." A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. Gable smirked, victorious. "I cannot see the color of her hair or her eyes. I cannot see the shape of her mouth or the line of her jaw. You look at her and you see a face. You have judged that face and you have found it wanting. You have spent her whole life telling her what you see. A mule, a plain creature, an object of pity and scorn." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. Lena was frozen, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. He was still holding her wrist, his thumb stroking the pulse point. "But you are the ones who are blind," he continued, his voice gaining a quiet power, a righteous fire. "I have been without sight for 2 years, but in the last few months, with this woman, I have seen more beauty than I ever saw in the 25 years my eyes worked. You see with your eyes. That is your curse. Because what you see is only a surface, a shell. You have let it blind you to what is real." He turned his head slightly, as if looking directly at Lena. "You want to know what I see when I am with Lena Pro. I see the color of courage when she walks into your town, knowing you will judge her. I see the shape of kindness in her hands when she helps me mend a fence I cannot see. I hear the music of a soul that has been told it is worthless, and yet has never, not once, been cruel. You talk about her face. You call it plain. You call it ugly." He lifted his other hand and gestured towards his own face, his clouded eyes. "A few months ago, I asked her if I could touch her face. I asked if she would let me see her in the only way I can. She was terrified, because you," he swept his hand out towards the crowd, "you taught her to be terrified of her own reflection. But she let me. She found the courage. And do you know what I felt?" The crowd was utterly still. Even the children had stopped their games. They were all listening, held captive by this blind man's testimony. "I did not feel a mule face," he said, his voice dropping to an intense personal whisper that everyone could hear. "I felt the warmth of the sun after a long winter. I felt the steady, patient strength of the earth. I felt a beauty so profound it silenced me. You look at her and see a plain face, I touch her cheek, and I feel sunlight. He let his hand fall. He turned back to the crowd, to the stunned face of Mrs. Gable. "So you keep your sight," he said, his voice ringing with a final, unbreakable authority. "You keep your judgments and your whispers and your petty, cruel world. I will keep what I have, a woman who taught a blind man what it truly means to see, and I would not trade what I see in her for all the sunsets I can no longer watch. You pity me? I pity you. Because you live in a world of shadows, and you do not even know it." He finished speaking. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of judgment. It was the silence of shame, of awe. Mrs. Gable's face was chalky white, her mouth hanging open. The people in the crowd looked at each other, at the ground, anywhere but at Lena and Cole. For the first time, they were the ones who felt judged. And for the first time, they saw the ugliness in themselves. Cole squeezed Lena's hand. "Let's go home," he whispered. She stood, her legs trembling, and let him lead her away. They walked out of the meadow, leaving the silent, shamed town behind them. No one tried to stop them. No one said a word. The sound of their footsteps on the path was the only sound in the world. They walked all the way back to her cabin without speaking. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in the brilliant oranges and purples she had so often described to him. Outside her small cabin stood the old rose bush, a gnarled, thorny thing that had been planted by her mother and had not produced a single bloom in a decade. But there, on one of its thorny branches, was a single, perfect bud, its petals just beginning to unfurl, a deep, velvety crimson, a promise. Cole stopped at her door. He did not ask to come in. He simply reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the path they had traced before. "Sunlight," he whispered again. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The word did not feel impossible anymore. It felt like truth. It felt like her name. That night, she slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, she woke with the sun. She walked through her small cabin, her home, which no longer felt like a prison. Her gaze fell on the shard of mirror by the door, the piece of glass that had dictated her worth for so long. She paused before it, seeing the faint, distorted sliver of her own eye looking back. She felt no compulsion to lean closer, to inspect, to judge. She felt nothing at all. She reached out and touched her own cheek, her rough fingers tracing the same path his had. She felt the bone, the skin, the warmth. She smiled, a small, real smile that reached her eyes. She never looked in the mirror again, because she finally believed what he said.